So we're going to start a series on the Shema. I'll explain a little bit for those of you who don't know. It's a mixed group here. Some of you probably know the Shema by heart. Some of you have never heard the word mentioned before. So it's going to be an easy series. I don't intend to do a long lesson each time because our purpose in this Zoom is to meditate together and to jump in the cosmic sea and create ripples of harmony, right? So that's our main purpose. But during this time, I'm going to be talking about the Shema and how it occurs to me that it is a call to mindlessness and mindfulness meditation, right? So in today's lesson, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the Shema, what it is, and its origin, right? Just a few minutes on that. And then next week, I'll dive into the Shema itself right from the beginning and tackle sort of, we'll tackle sort of each verse. Perhaps in the beginning, the first verse is really monumental, so we might just go word or two at a time, okay? But it's just gentle and easy teaching and not like any long teaching, right? So basically the Shema is probably the holiest so-called, I'll say so-called prayer within the context of the Hebrew tradition, within Judaism. So it's a prayer that's said in the morning and in the evening, and it's written on parchment and put into these boxes that Jewish people put on their doors. So you come to my house and there's a parchment, there's a thing on the door. No, I have no idea what's in it. Well, what's in it is the words of this so-called prayer, right? Same thing with, you might have seen very Orthodox Jews wearing what's called tefillin, right? Tefillin is things that little plastic looking thing that goes on your head and on your arm. And inside of that is also these words. And generally speaking, they're considered to be sort of the holiest of holy words. They're spoken on your deathbed a lot of times. There's harrowing stories of great sages who were being persecuted and in all sorts of horrible ways. And of course, the last thing on their lips was this Shema, right? And really, if you look at it and you read it, it's more of a call to do something than it actually is a prayer. Because when we think about prayer, we think about perhaps one of the Psalms or the morning prayers, or saying, to God, thank you for this, or thank you for restoring your soul to me, or perhaps we're asking, for help with something like in one of the Psalms, or so on and so forth. It's an obvious prayer. Whereas in this case, the Shema, and generally speaking, it's considered its origins from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, right? And as such, it's Moses speaking very definitively, right, to the people in his charge. He's speaking with definitive power, saying, "Hear, O Israel, hear, listen," right? And we'll get into that word next week in detail, right? So what we're repeating in the morning and in the evening is really a call to action that came through Moses and is written in Deuteronomy 6:4 and the following verses, right? But it's become sort of a hallmark of what's called the Jewish prayers. And as I said, it's in the tefillin, it's in the mezuzah, and it's in the morning prayers, it's in the evening prayers, it's in the Shabbat prayers in the synagogues. It's all over the place, everywhere, right? So we're understanding Semitic mysticism, I think it's a good idea to take a look at it and see what is this actually saying, and how does it possibly relate to our lives and also to this call to meditation. So I'm going to suggest a few things in this teaching as we go through the series that are somewhat different than what you may have heard if you know a lot about the Shema before. And I want to say right from the beginning, I'm not saying that what I am going to teach on it is in any way negating what the traditional teaching on it is. It's just adding to it or looking at it from a different perspective, perhaps a deeper perspective, right? And the way I was taught it and what I've studied about it and experienced about it. So I'm going to go a little further with the origins, a little further back than Moses, right? And I'm going to talk about Jacob. Not Jacob Edelstein, our friend and guest right here, but Jacob from the Torah, right? And look at him. So in Genesis 49, there's lots of stories about Jacob in the Torah, and they're all mystical, and they all have these metaphorical, allegorical meanings that you could study for days on end, and they just open your mind to all these mystical concepts, like Jacob's ladder or Jacob wrestling with the angel of God, right? But this particular chapter 49, is Jacob blessing his children when he's passing on. And I'm going to draw the origins of the Shema to that event. But even earlier, historically speaking, so we have what's in the Torah written, and then what we also have is what we call the oral traditions. So those oral traditions have also now been put into writings, some of them, not all of them, like the Talmud and the Midrash in particular, right? So those books tell us, among others, that more about the details of Jacob's life. Because as in all the patriarchs written in the Torah, just like in the Veda, when they talk about Krishna or Rama or all of Arjuna, all of these characters, there's big gaps. You don't know what they did, some of them as children or as teenagers or further on in their lives. There's just these stories about them that leave big gaps. So this is the oral tradition, and the Midrash and the Talmud fill in some of these gaps, right? So concerning Jacob, it's said that he spent 14 years in the tents of Shem and Eber. 14 years is a long time. Now, Shem and Eber are really considered to be sort of the school, the first school of the mystical tradition, of the Semitic tradition. So when we say Semitic tradition of meditation or Kabbalism, which comes from the Semitic tradition, really comes from Shem. That's what we say. Semitic comes from Shem, right? Shem was the good son of Noah. And his great-grandson was Eber. Now, Shem means, anyone know what Shem means? In Hebrew, it means name. And it should sound familiar to you because we're doing a whole series on the Shema, which sounds a whole lot like the word Shem. So the root of Shema, which literally means listen or hear, the root of it is Shem, so it's Shin Mem, and Shem means name. So the father of this tradition of mysticism, his name means name, and his great-grandson's name, Eber, is the root for the word Hebrew, and it means to cross over, right? So there's meaning there that's relatively obvious. We're using these names and the sounds of these holy names to cross over these borders of consciousness into higher consciousness, right? And this is what Shem and Eber mean. So not only were they potentially, I mean, I have no evidence, there's no evidence this far back in history, but not only were Shem and Eber people, the son of Noah and his great-grandson, but the concept of the name Shem and the name Eber is what is the basis or foundation, really, of our meditation practice. As we're, of course, using breath as well, and then we're using the sounds of these names, both externally and internally, to cross over, as the word forever means, right? So, according to our tradition, both written and oral, Jacob studied in the tents of Shem and Eber. According to the oral tradition, he lived with them in their tents, studying and meditating for 14 years, right? So, and there's also in the oral tradition that Abraham, his grandfather, and Isaac, his father, also spent their time studying and meditating in these tents. And so, as a result of that, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were called well drillers. And we've talked about that. If you've learned how to meditate from the UMI practice, we talked about what that is, right? We're drilling inside, unfreezing the klipot, those barriers, to the unified field within us, pure consciousness, Ein Sof, right? God within, the kingdom of heaven within, however you want to call it. So this is, the root of that comes from Shem, the name, and Eber, crossing over. So we're saying that Jacob studied and lived with them in the oral tradition for 14 years. It's a long time. You know, many of us think, oh my gosh, I've been meditating every day, twice a day. Not all of us think that, but some of us think that. I've been meditating every day, twice a day, for 6 months, for a year. I'm not enlightened yet. Where am I going to cross over this border? Well, when you feel that way, think of Abraham, who there's reports that it was 39 years, a lot of reports that it was 49 years in the tents of Shem and Eber. Jacob, 14 years. So, you know, this thing is a process that we do. This drilling is a process, and there are borders that we cross along the way, right? So how is this the origin of the Shema? It's the origin of the Shema because Jacob studied these things, and then he went out into the field of activity. Now, if you know, I said 14 years, that's 2 sets of 7. So I don't really go too much into gematria here. Gematria is the study of the numbers associated with the letters and the names, right? So there's lots of different types of gematria, and we'll do a little bit of it in this series, just to point out a few things. But if you're in the Sefer Yetzirah class, you know that when we're looking at this mystically, we think of ourselves like the tabernacle or the temple, where there's a holy of holies within us, an inner court, and then in the world of our actions, there's an outer court. 7 is the number of the inner court. It's like a number of perfection. It's a 7 double letters, right? So we'll be looking at that number a little bit more next week. You talk about Jacob studying for 14 years. It's kind of an obvious little hint to 2 sevens, studying the inner court within himself through the processes that we use. So here's Jacob. he also passes this knowledge on, as he was instructed to by Shem and Eber, to his children. Now he goes through all these things, and at the end of his life, in chapter 49, he assembles his children, and he's leaving, his soul is leaving his body, and he's blessing his children. And he has some fear that they have forgotten the names and the mystical meditations on the names. So he expresses this to them, and this is part of the oral tradition. And their response to him is really the first verse of the Shema. Now, this isn't written in the Torah, but the suggestion here is they say to him, "Hear, O Israel, Yud He Vav He." Right? So they're telling him, Israel, which is a name given to him by the angel, remember? We know these letters, we know this very special name. And his fear dissipates, and he says, Baruch Shem Kavod Malkut Olam. Right? He says, blessed, he blesses God for his name has been remembered and glorious forever. Now, we'll get into those things when we get into the actual Shema. But what I'm saying is, what is the origins of this? The origins go back to the whole tradition of Kabbalistic or Semitic mysticism, with Shem and Eber, name, crossing over, the teaching to Jacob, his children reinforcing to him and letting his fears go that they remembered these things because they had somewhat of a dysfunctional family and life that you can remember when they had some little fighting going on with Joseph. So all of this happens, and then he blesses them. Okay? So with that background, maybe have a look, if you get a chance, at Deuteronomy 6:4, where Moses says the whole Shema, and that's where the text comes from. And have a look at Genesis 49, where Jacob blesses his children, if you get a chance. So that's it for today. And next week, we'll get right into the first line of the Shema itself.